In his video, 12 Contradictions in the Bible, skeptic Holy Koolaid includes the standard laundry list of complaints against the birth narratives. Leave it to skeptics to try and stuff a coal in the stockings of Christians every year at Christmas time. Let's see what Thomas has for us.
Only 2 of the 4 canonical Gospels even tell the story of Jesus' birth, and these 2 accounts are irreconcilably different. In both stories, Jesus is born in Bethlehem, but in Matthew, after Jesus' birth, King Herod hears about baby Jesus, described as the future king of the Jews. He feels threatened and has every baby under the age of 2 slaughtered, while Jesus' parents, Mary and Joseph, escape with their child to Egypt until after Herod's death. Compare this to Luke's Gospel, where not only is there no mention of Herod's massacre, but Jesus' parents peacefully stick around Bethlehem until it's time for the baby's ritual purification, which was 33 days after his birth, according to the Jewish law in Leviticus 12. They do that in Jerusalem, where Herod was ruling. And while there, a righteous old man and a prophetess approach baby Jesus in broad daylight in a crowded temple and start shouting to everyone who will listen that this is the coming Messiah. To Jews at the time, the Messiah was believed to be a warrior king of prophecy who would overthrow the Romans, and yet Herod does nothing.
The idea that if this really happened, the news surely would have reached Herod is a bit of a stretch. We don't know anything about Simeon or Anna's volume when they approached the Holy Family. We are told that Anna spent her days praying in the temple, and Luke says that she spoke about the child to all who were looking forward to the redemption of Jerusalem, but he doesn't specifically say that she got up and announced to everyone standing there in the temple right then and there that the child had been born. Maybe this happened a little bit afterwards. Luke says nothing about how many people were actually present at the temple, or what their response even was if there was one. We know that a woman's testimony wasn't well regarded in first century Palestine, so any onlookers might have thought that this was just the ramblings of a crazy old woman, and those who regarded her as a prophetess were probably not going to run off and tell Herod. Compare this to Matthew, where the Magi come directly to Herod and ask where the king of the Jews was because of the signs that they saw in the sky. So what about the family hanging around in Bethlehem? I thought Matthew said that they went to Egypt. Here's Holy Koolaid once again.
And Jesus' family immediately and uneventfully head back to their home in Nazareth, about a month after his birth. Joseph lives in Nazareth. The only reason that they go to Bethlehem is for some weird census. So when they move back to Nazareth, they're just naturally going home. But in Matthew, Joseph and Mary are residents of Bethlehem. There's no need for a census to get them there, and hence no mention of it. There's no mention of a manger either, because why would you give birth in a barn when you have a local home? After Jesus is born, Magi from the east set out on a journey from a foreign country to meet him, and he's still with his family in Bethlehem when they arrive, living in a local house. And this was likely significantly after Jesus' birth, since the author of Matthew uses the Greek word paidion to describe Jesus as a young boy when the wise men arrived, rather than the Greek word vrephos, or infant, which would have been used if he had just been born.
Okay, so what exactly is going on here? Well, from Matthew's account, one might weakly presume that Bethlehem was their hometown and they had lived there from the start, but Matthew doesn't actually say anything like that. Matthew 1 describes Joseph's dream, the discovery that Mary is pregnant, and that he's taking her as a wife, but he doesn't explicitly tell us the location of any of these events, and he certainly doesn't say that it's happening in Bethlehem. Matthew starts chapter 2 rather abruptly by saying that after Jesus was born in Bethlehem during Herod's reign, Magi from the east came. He does state that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, but he doesn't mention how long they had been there, or that they were there during her entire pregnancy. Matthew doesn't even mention a house until the wise men arrive, and he doesn't call it the house that Jesus was born in, but rather the place where the child was. Holy Koolaid at least correctly points out that this visit occurred within a couple of years after Jesus' birth. That's more than enough time to get a house and follow the Mosaic childbirth laws. This whole house discrepancy is an entirely manufactured contradiction. Now, the only thing that amounts to an apparent discrepancy between the 2 stories is Luke's writing in such a way that could plausibly be interpreted to mean that Joseph and Mary went immediately back to Nazareth after Mary's purification rites were completed. Even if Luke was unaware of the flight to Egypt and the events surrounding it, like the slaughter of the innocents, Luke's account does not specifically say that they immediately returned to Nazareth, so it is not apparent that there's even an error in Luke's account at all. It is possible that sometime in the 2-year gap the Holy Family settled in Bethlehem. There are a few reasons why one would find this reasonable. For starters, in Luke 2:4 we learn that Bethlehem was Joseph's hometown, although he may have been living in Nazareth for a while. And we know that Mary was from Nazareth. And I have to say it's doubtful that they arrived there just as Mary was about to give birth. They would have been there for some time. Luke 2:41 also reveals that the Holy Family visited Jerusalem annually, so instead of traveling 65 miles a year, being 6 miles from Jerusalem would have made that trip a whole lot easier. Also, due to the unexplainable nature of Mary's pregnancy, they may have believed it prudent to avoid the scandal of living at home. Perhaps they relocated to a place where they could remain more anonymous. All one has to imagine is that sometime during those several weeks spent in Bethlehem, Joseph found work, got a house, and said to Mary, "Hey, let's move back here from Nazareth." They'd go back to Nazareth and get their stuff and come back. But even if I'm wrong about this conjecture, and it isn't the most natural reading of the text, one single possible difference indicating plausibly a simple lack of information on the part of one of the gospel writers is a very far cry from being irreconcilably different, as Holy Koolaid says. So let's see what else Thomas has for us.
And after fleeing to Egypt, rather than returning to Nazareth, because according to Luke, that was their home, they only relocate there because Herod's cruel son Archelaus was now ruling over Bethlehem, which was their home, but they couldn't go back to. On an ironic side note though, Herod's other son, Herod Antipas, was ruling in Nazareth where they fled to, and according to the Gospels, would later play a role in the execution of both John the Baptist, Jesus' cousin, and Jesus himself.
I have to say, this is actually evidence of Matthew's truthfulness rather than the other way around. 3,000 Jews were massacred by Archelaus at Passover, earning him the bloody reputation that he had. Here's what went down. Some Jews were outraged to see Roman shields posted over the gate of the temple. These shields had eagle's wings on them, and so they saw this as a clear sign of disrespect and idolatry. Therefore, some devout men cut them down, and consequently they were immediately put to death. As you could imagine, this didn't set well with the Jews. Every year, thousands of people attended Passover, and the story spread quite rapidly. Jews stoned a few Roman soldiers, and Archelaus got wind of it and decided to pull "there's a new sheriff in town" routine, and he ordered the slaughter as a show of his authority. Passover ended up being canceled. Those who had come from outside Jerusalem had to return home. As one of his first acts as tetrarch, this made him wildly unpopular with pretty much everyone. This overreaction brought Archelaus into danger of not being confirmed as tetrarch at all, but he traveled to Rome and smoothed things over with Caesar Augustus, and he ended up getting the job anyways. Lydia McGrew notes the historical value of this mention of Archelaus. She writes, Matthew mentions Joseph's fears about Archelaus very much in passing. He does not say why Joseph thought it was better to take his family to live under the rule of Antipas than that of Archelaus. He makes no mention of anything specific that was worrisome about Archelaus. Moreover, the mention of Archelaus is extra from a theological and narrative point of view, since Matthew also says that Joseph was warned at that time in a dream. The dream could have accomplished the goal of taking Mary and Joseph back to Nazareth if Matthew invented this part of the story. So why mention Archelaus at all? The simplest explanation is that it is true that Joseph was afraid of Archelaus, probably because he heard of his recent bloodshed, and that Matthew in some manner learned about this aspect of Joseph's thoughts. Now, Antipas was a bad dude, but he didn't have this same bloody reputation compared to Archelaus at the time. Jesus later purposely provoked Antipas during his ministry, calling him a fox. It's almost like Jesus came to earth to be crucified after he fulfilled his ministry, not to die while he was a child. And John the Baptist was killed for opposing Antipas's marriage to his brother's wife. That Thomas unironically calls this ironic is rather silly. Furthermore, Tim McGrew notes an interesting agreement between Matthew 2:22 and the end of Luke chapter 2. He writes, "This is one other point of interest about the reference to Archelaus. He was deposed by the Romans and banished to Gaul in the year 6 AD, about 10 years after he took the throne, in the 12th year after Jesus' birth. Curiously enough, Luke's narrative, which never mentions Archelaus, tells us that Jesus' parents went up to Jerusalem for the feast every year, but the first time it mentions his going with them is when Jesus was 12 years old. The chronological coincidence isn't a guarantee, but it is at least plausible that they took Jesus with them only when Archelaus was no longer in power and the shadow of their harrowing journey to Egypt had passed." But Holy Koolaid has one more parting shot.
Oh, and Herod died in 4 BCE. So if Jesus was born during his reign at least a year or two before that, as Matthew claims, heck, even if he was born just a week before Herod died, then this still directly contradicts Luke's claim that he was born during the census of Governor Quirinius, because Quirinius didn't become governor until 6 CE, 10 years after Herod's death.
So Holy Koolaid insists that Luke must be saying that this census took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria and that it has to be the 6 AD census. Luke royally botched it up. Checkmate, Christians. But Thomas's claim has huge problems. Luke clearly says that John the Baptist was conceived during the time of Herod the Great, and John the Baptist is only 6 months older than Jesus. And according to Acts 5:37, Luke also knew about the census under Quirinius in 6 AD. There's also the fact that Luke has all kinds of definite time indicators at the beginning of John the Baptist's ministry and consequently Jesus' ministry. On these indicators, Jesus would be far too young if Luke thought he was born in 6 AD, so there's not even a chance that Holy Koolaid can possibly be right here. Furthermore, historians and not just desperate Christian apologists have tried to solve this problem in many ways. Some argue that Josephus got it wrong and Luke got it right. For one thing, Luke is a historical source himself with a track record at least as reliable as Josephus's. To say that we have no other historical source for a census in Judea at this time is just a weak argument from silence. Just because Luke is a Christian writer doesn't mean he's guilty before being proven innocent. And he's not even talking about a miracle here. You can't get much more mundane and boring than a census. And historians have noted that Josephus does have his own issues with chronology. Other scholars have suggested that the translation of the passage is incorrect. Some argue that the word translated as first in Luke 2:2 should actually be translated as before in this context. It follows that if Luke was saying that Jesus was born before the famous census taken under Quirinius, then there would be no conflict between Luke and Josephus. This is the view of N.T. Wright, who is no slouch when it comes to reading the Greek. According to another theory, the census of Judea may have begun under Herod's reign when Jesus was born, but it hadn't been completed until Quirinius' reign in 6 AD. The reading would be, this enrollment was first completed, i.e. used, when Quirinius was governor of Syria. During this, the census became associated with Quirinius' name, which is why Luke refers to it in the way that he does. The political complexities in Judea during this time and the Jewish resistance to Roman taxation provide us with plenty of reasons to think why the census may have been stalled or interrupted so as to stretch it over many years. According to the classical historian Paul Meyer, it took 40 years to conduct a census at Gaul around the same time. So it could very well be that a count was made or begun in Judea before the death of Herod, and Quirinius may have only made use of it to collect tax in 6 AD when he came to clean up Archelaus' mess. These are just a few of the options. There are more that go beyond the scope of this video, and it's somewhat complicated stuff. And as Lydia McGrew has pointed out in her debate with atheist Jonathan Pierce on the British show Unbelievable, the idea that Luke made up the census or moved Jesus' birth to a much later time to get Jesus to Bethlehem is absolutely ridiculous. That's like trying to crack a nut with a cement truck. If Luke wanted to force Jesus to be born in Bethlehem contrary to the fact, all he'd have to do is have Mary and Joseph start out in Bethlehem and later travel to Nazareth. He didn't have to invent the idea that Mary was from Nazareth. Instead, they had to travel from there to Bethlehem and then back to Nazareth when she was pregnant. A Roman census for such a purpose would be an absolutely implausible plot device. Luke deliberately connecting it falsely with Quirinius and placing it at a time that is in blatant conflict with all of Luke's other time indicators is overwhelmingly unlikely. It just doesn't add up. If Luke was inventing a census out of nowhere, he didn't need to mention Quirinius at all. So the Christian apologist isn't doing mental gymnastics by putting several theories on the table. We do this kind of thing when historical events aren't super clear all the time. When it comes to the birth narratives, Holy Koolaid is wrong to say that the Gospels are irreconcilably different. Even two ultra-liberal scholars, Marcus Borg and John Dominic Crossan, have acknowledged that it is not impossible to harmonize them, referring to the birth narratives. So don't let Holy Koolaid wreck your Christmas.